we had a more comprehensive picture of the Ohio primary electorate than any other campaign in the state in history.
I'm Eric Wilson, managing partner of Startup Caucus, an investment fund and incubator for Republican campaign technology. Welcome to the Business of Politics show. On this podcast, we bring you into conversation with the entrepreneurs who build best-in-class political businesses, the funders who provide the capital, and the operatives who put it all together to win campaigns. Today, we're speaking with Luke Thompson, co-founder of Cerberus Strategies. He's a political strategist with a deep background in data. Luke has done work for the NRSC, the Jeb Bush Super PAC, and Applecart. In our conversation, we dive into his latest campaign in the Ohio GOP Senate primary, how he approaches decision-making, and the ways he thinks technology is shifting politics. Luke, you have more letters after your name, from academic degrees, I should say, including PhD, than anyone I know working hands-on in politics. How does that education and background in academia shape your approach to campaigning?
Yeah, I wanted a more respectable life than professor, so I went for the, stability and social desirability of Republican political consultant.
Yeah, I think you probably need a refund on your degree if you thought that was a good idea.
Word to the wise: don't ever pay for a PhD. You pay for it by teaching. Don't ever. It was great. I had a wonderful experience. I suppose probably the biggest thing is it imbues in one a sense of perspective that may manifest as an element of fatalism.
You're going to have to unpack that.
Yeah. So I did a lot of work on both American political development research, which is stuff that covers the trajectory of institutional change over time in the United States. And then on the flip side, I also did some research assistant stuff for people doing field experiments and more quantitative measurements of how interventions might change behavior, be that political behavior in the form of voting or how you get people to say, think about things differently or sign up for different courses even while they're undergraduates. I learned from combining those two things that while interventions in the real world can make a really big difference in terms of outcomes in discrete cases, and in some instances those outcome changes lead to broader historical changes because of the people who win or lose. In many cases, you can do your absolute best. This is especially true in general elections. Speaking of political outcomes or electoral outcomes, you can do your absolute best and it doesn't make a damn lick of difference, right? Almost all U.S. House campaigns, for instance, are going to be determined by A, the underlying partisanship of the electorate, B, the shape of the economy with reference to which party holds the White House, and C, how people feel about foreign policy and national security with reference to which party holds the White House. However, there are, we'll say within the whole run of 435 House races, there are going to be 10 of them that are going to be decided by campaign quality, setting aside those structural factors, setting aside candidate quality. Say 10 of them are going to be decided by who runs a better campaign, or 5. The key is you don't know if you're going to be in one of those 5. And so you have to play as hard.
When do you know?
2 weeks out, maybe. Sometimes you don't even know until the next day, right? Until the day after Election Day. So you have to assume you're going to be one of those 5 from the day you start campaigning, and campaign like hell, thinking it's going to matter, recognizing that it probably won't. And I would say that my education makes me comfortable with that.
So does that mean that are you avoiding races that you don't see or projects where you don't see the campaign having an outcome, or is it something different where you approach everything as very competitive?
Yeah, it's the latter. Look, the best thing to do for a career in political consulting is go find a bunch of uncompetitive races, run up a really high win ratio, and then say you're a genius, right?
Right.
If I could only run Senate races in Alabama with incumbent senators, that'd be great.
Not a lot of money or excitement there.
Yeah, you make a lot of money. There's not a lot of excitement. There's not a lot of intellectual legwork, but it's good from a professional and work-life balance standpoint. But no, it's much more the latter. It's one, in an environment like this year where it's going to be a good year for Republicans, it means go out and be aggressive, recruit candidates in seats that have not been on the map before, because you might be in those five, right? There's going to be a seat that's either a likely or safe Dem seat today
that we pick
that
up.
that we're going to pick up,
Yeah.
right? Or if we don't pick up, we're going to come within 2 or 3 points of it, where if we'd had a real campaign operation, we could have picked it up.
Yeah. I think that's a really good perspective. And the way I put this a lot of times is, not everything that a winning campaign did was right, and not everything a losing campaign did was wrong, because there's so much beyond your control. And I think another thing that contributes to this is that it is, yes, it is a zero-sum game, right? Someone has to win and someone has to lose, but also there are other players on the field. And what I mean by that is, let's say you are putting up a stiffer challenge than someone has seen before in an otherwise non-competitive race. Well, that's going to divert resources from the other side. And I'm curious to hear how you approach that or factor that into decision making.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. And you see that a lot if you're at the committees. The House committee, they have a more fixed battleground, and you can only redirect resources so much in House races. But if you look at something like the Senate committee, when I was there in 2014, um, we were rebuilding. People probably don't remember this, but the 2012 cycle was a really rough cycle. 2010 had been as well. There was a sense that we'd left some opportunities on the table. So the personnel changed completely going into 2014. It was a more or less whole new team, except for some administrative staff. And as a result, we were kind of building from the ground up, and we did some really fun and innovative stuff, and that's where I learned a lot about this business. But we didn't have an opportunity to throw some Hail Mary passes in, say, Illinois or New Jersey, where those are both very expensive states. They had
Or Virginia.
Well, in Virginia was a slightly different thing, and you guys on the Gillespie campaign did a phenomenal job, and I'll actually get to that in a minute, because there's a counter case there, and Virginia fits it. But when you have incumbent Democrats who can't self-fund but have fundraising bases, and Durbin and Booker would have been both of those, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's where you can apply real institutional pressure to distribute money to other seats that would be safe. And hey, maybe you win one, right? I mean, people forget, but Mark Kirk was,
Right.
senator from Illinois, right? And likewise, Doug Jones was senator from Alabama for a couple of years, and those can make a big difference, right? Those are things that matter. Virginia was a slightly different case because Mark Warner is such a prohibitive self-funder,
Right.
that we felt at the committee at the time, and I'm sure you guys in the Gillespie campaign disagreed with this, but that if we were going to be effective, we needed to run below the radar to the greatest extent possible, because Mark could just cut a $25 million check into his own campaign the next day. Right. Which is not something that Dick Durbin can do, not something that Cory Booker can do. And you have to be mindful of that risk as well, because if we were seen to be coming in and Warner cut that check, he could have just buried you guys. Whereas you were racing, and it looked like you might catch him with a snipe attack that he didn't see coming.
Right.
And that's the sort of give and take there.
Luke, you run the Independent Expenditure Super PAC that supported J.D. Vance in the recent Ohio Senate primary, where he prevailed. So congratulations there. Our listeners should go read the Politico story from past guest on this podcast, Alex Eisenstadt, which I think it was a good read, and I'll link to in the show notes. Hindsight makes everything look inevitable.
Sure.
But what was the biggest risk in your unconventional strategy?
Well, I mean, let me say, I think the piece does a good job of covering a lot of what we did that was innovative. But when you win a race by 8 points, that's not the super PAC, that's the candidate, right? I mean, this goes back to your first question about perspective and how much can you change. I mean, we felt like we did a good job of putting JD in a place that he could win by making him visible to the electorate. But JD Vance won that campaign, right? I mean, he went out there, and he's an extraordinarily talented candidate with a discrete message. He knows his own mind. He can articulate it. He can relate it to voters. He campaigns extremely hard. He won.
That's a really good example of an IE or super PAC can help change the atmospherics or the weather. But it's still, I guess the metaphor I always go back to is your campaign is like a ship, and you are chasing the wind, you've got sails deployed, different, analogies like that, but you can't change the weather. In certain cases, with big resources like a super PAC that's well funded, you can shift some of those fundamentals for a campaign. So I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, we can put the ball over the plate for, like, if you think about it like the home run derby, right? We can toss the ball over the plate, but he's still got to hit it. And he did. I mean, he crushed it for 400 feet, right? Like, it was quite an effort. In terms of the biggest risk, which you asked about, there were probably two, one of which is obvious, the other of which is less obvious. So the first is, we got a very large check from Peter Thiel early on. He's unique as a donor in that he's willing to take big risks by cutting big checks, or at least he was in this case, and do it really early. Most donors will cut their checks late, and that minimizes the efficacy of those contributions. We had his contribution about a year before election day.
Why is that?
Well, I mean, it depends. So a lot of donors are interested in only backing winners, so they tend to spread the wealth around, so to speak, and cut a lot of smaller, mid-sized checks to a lot of people who they have a pretty good reason to think are going to win.
But why does waiting change things?
Oh, well, I mean, if you look at the way we spent money, so we only spent about 60% of that initial contribution on ads, which is a very low percentage for a super PAC.
A typical super PAC might spend
80,
70, 80, 90.
Yeah, exactly. Instead, we spent $500,000 building an enormous data and testing apparatus so that we had a more comprehensive picture of the Ohio primary electorate than any other campaign in the state in history, period, bar none. So we knew where there were voters. That was a big risk, though, because if JD wasn't competitive, all the data science in the world isn't going to make a difference, right? People think of data as automating campaigns, and it doesn't. It will help you maximize your tactical efficiency in where you allocate dollars, and ours did that. If you look at our indexing, the indexes on our buys and things like that, we were better and more efficient than everybody else. We saw opportunities and we took them that other people didn't even see, let alone take. But we had to spend capital to get there, and having early money made that possible. We spent a lot of money on opposition research and on polling research. Again, a super PAC typically wouldn't do that. You'd wait until very close to election day or the beginning of early voting, do a couple of polls, and then spend based on that, right? We instead did that research on issues, on vulnerabilities, and on other things really early on. And again, there are risks involved in that. Some of our early issue polling showed that immigration and inflation were not high propensity issues or high salience issues.
Mm-hmm.
My reasoning when I got that back, a year before election day was, well, okay, that's helpful to get a portrait of where things are now, but you have a new Democratic administration with a weak leader and narrow Democratic majorities in the House and Senate. So
you
probably
knew where the low watermark was.
Yeah, and it was also just, look, what are they going to be able to do? They're going to be able to spend money like drunk sailors and open the border. So immigration and inflation may not be big issues now. I'm willing to bet that they're going to be big issues in a year. Maybe that was a byproduct of having some historical perspective, right, from my educational background that you brought up earlier. Maybe that was just good luck. Who knows? But that was something that we sort of saw coming. And then, of course, the biggest risk we took. Now, reputationally, if you have a big check and you spend it on things that aren't ads and you lose, people say you're an idiot, right? So that was a risk from the sort of politics standpoint. But that was a risk worth taking because we knew we were going to be outspent, right? I know this may sound surprising to your listeners, but when you're running against initially 5 and then 4 self-funders, slash a guy who brought $5 million in hard dollars in his campaign account into the race on day one, you're going to be outgunned even with a very well-resourced super PAC. A big part of that is because campaign dollars, as you get closer to election day, when the overwhelming majority of voters are making up their minds, are going, twice or 3 times as far in terms of buying TV, buying radio, buying cable as an outside group dollar. Right. Federal law requires that candidates get the lowest available rate, right, whereas super PACs have to pay issue rate, which is a market-driven thing. And as a result, Josh Mandel's $5 million was worth easily $12 million in outside spending, right?
Right.
To say nothing of the, I don't know, 8 or 9 million that he got from the Club for Growth.
Got it.
So
And
he was, if not, I mean, Mike Gibbons was probably the best resource candidate. Josh was a close second, and then Dolan was probably, well, Dolan might have been, Josh and Dolan were basically in the same place, and then Jane Timken overall probably had about the same or slightly more purchasing power as us.
got it. So your challenge was, where do we find those asymmetric advantages to really put some leverages and really outkick your coverage? I'm just running through all the metaphors now.
All the metaphors.
But
I can do some coach speak too. We just had to play our game.
Right.
Let the game come to us. Slow down.
But that is Peter Thiel. His worldview is you make big bets and you get outsized returns. One of the things that was really interesting about your strategy is because of the rules around coordination and independent expenditures, you had to make a lot of information public, and it exposed sensitive details about your campaign strategy, vulnerabilities, everything you discussed. And we know that your opponents had access to this, and we know now that his Democratic opponent has access to this. And
Sure.
So I heard this criticism a lot from people when they read the story, and I think that might have given an advantage a few decades ago. But today, this information is all pretty easily accessible. I want to hear from you. Why do you think so many in the political industry still hold on to this conventional wisdom that there exist gatekeepers and that we have the ability to control information?
Yeah, I mean, did I maybe save the Mandel campaign some money on putting together a J.D. Vance opposition research book? Maybe, but it sounds like they found the blog in January or February, and if they hadn't put together an opposition research book by that point, then that's professional malpractice. So I'm pretty sure I didn't really save them any money. Yes, I guess they had access to my strategic thoughts because I was writing a blog that was for our donors and supporters in a fairly narrow group, and I also figured the campaign would see. And that's why I put those documents up there to make them available, hoping that the campaign would get them and use them. Because unlike television, there's not a candidate discount on opposition research. There's not a candidate discount on polling, right? So I did all the polling and oppo research that normally a campaign would do. I'm sure there are people who are going to poo-poo it. I defy them to come up with a better strategy, given that you're going to be massively outspent. We had this asymmetry. It was an asymmetry that we could try to exploit. That was my solution for trying to exploit it. I would absolutely do it again. I wouldn't change anything about how we did it. And frankly, anybody from one of the other campaigns who wants to criticize that choice, I would ask them why it was that they had access to my strategic thinking and still couldn't beat us.
Right. So I want to press that just a little bit more, which is, does that strategy of sort of open sourcing the strategy and the data only make sense when there's an asymmetrical contest, or do you think it's something that more campaigns should look at?
Yeah, I mean, look, if I were the Gibbons campaign, I wouldn't do it because they had enough money in their account. Same with the Dolan,
because he was able to self-fund.
Because he was able to self-fund, okay. Right? Any situation where you can have the candidate, to the extent that you can bring things inside the campaign, you should always do that. We were in this spot where we had a guy who was reasonably well known, but not super well known, who had access to major donors. So we knew he could raise enough money to be competitive, right? And provided he did high quality advertising. And he did, which we should get to in a second, because this is related to the blog. The question was just, how do we make it so that JD has the most loose dollars on hand to spend on TV and cable and radio and mail, the differential areas, right? The places where you get meaningful candidate economies. Yeah, how do we do that, given that we have all this money in the super PAC? And that's why we put the data in the super PAC. That's why we put the polling in the super PAC. That's why we put the research in the super PAC. And then that's why I've known JD for several years. He is uniquely, as a candidate, somebody who has really firm opinions and knows his own mind. And so because I know him and we've been conversation partners for many years, I could kind of anticipate his thinking on a lot of issues. You couldn't do that with every candidate, right? Because a lot of candidates don't know how they feel about things, right? A new event, the Ukraine war shows up, right? And you saw a lot of candidates run towards conventional wisdom. And JD has convictions. He has beliefs. He articulated those beliefs. I think he would, maybe change his phraseology a little bit in one particular case around how he articulated those. But his basic view was the United States federal government cannot walk and chew gum at the same time. It should be focused on issues close at hand, like the drug crisis, like the southern border, and not be distracted or using this foreign policy imbroglio or using this foreign policy crisis to distract Americans from a fundamental governance failure by the part of the federal government. I figured that was probably where he was going to go. I happen to be quite sympathetic to that view, so it helped me because my intuitions ran similar to his. But I wasn't surprised that he was willing to stake this position out. The other four candidates didn't know how they felt about it. They weren't moving from a position of firm convictions. And so they all kind of chased what the media narrative was, which was, maximal commitment to Ukraine. Out of the gate, Jane Timken, Matt Dolan said they wanted a no-fly zone. Josh Mandel and Mike Gibbons got bullied by the press into saying they were okay with a no-fly zone if it was European-led, which was always a fig leaf for an actual no-fly zone. All of those things were themselves collectively a fig leaf for American direct military intervention in Ukraine, which is a massively unpopular position, not just with the Republican primary electorate, but the electorate writ large. One little bit of anecdotal evidence for how true this is that JD won Parma, the Cleveland suburb, which has the largest Ukrainian American population in the United States, which everybody said he was going to lose, and thus by losing, he would lose the entire Senate primary.
I think you were your universe, your sample size of everyone is very small, because that's the first time I'm hearing about the Ukrainian vote in Parma. That just shows how in the weeds you were on this.
It was very much a beltway political horse race media thing. JD's pissed off the 44,000 Ukrainian Americans in Parma, Ohio, of whom 30,000 are Democrats, by the way.
Meanwhile, they're missing the bigger story, which is a campaign and a super PAC putting together a really awesome organization. And
also, we knew who the Ukrainian voters were because we'd modeled them out. Right. Like, so when people started talking about this population, I could go into my voter file that was, had $500,000.
You didn't have to guess.
I didn't have to guess. I could tell you down to households who this was going to move. Now, we didn't know how they were going to move, but we knew what our maximum downside risk was, and it was negligible. Meanwhile, all of our opponents were taking a massively unpopular position on this war that, the million Republican primary voters we expected to vote in, and then, it turned out to be a little more than 1 million who voted. We knew that 3/4 of them didn't agree. Actually, more like, 5/6 of them didn't agree. But all of our opponents were going way out there and taking the 1 of 6 position.
And that's I really want to underline this for our listeners, because it's an important lesson here, which is so much of modern campaigns, and we're going to get to this in just a minute, but a little bit of a preview. So much of modern campaigns comes down to investing early in infrastructure, things like data, research, polling, so you can make informed decisions when the going gets tough. And so, Luke, I want to ask you, what is your approach to the question of resource allocation when you're developing a strategy? Is there something that you always do no matter what the budget is?
I rent a voter file really early because the monthly cost on a voter file isn't very much. And you have time.
Just give us numbers, like, so people understand.
It's a few $100 a month
for a state like Ohio.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, and then
I want to. This is really in the weeds, but because you are the the super PAC, you are not able to get that from GOP Data Center, and
correct,
and that's why you have to pay for it.
Yeah. Whereas campaigns can get it for free, but I get a voter file early. I write a lot of code myself still. And you have some time to do that early on. So as we do voter contact and I get raw data back, I start appending those files or write the code to append them on case-by-case uses, right? And that's everything from text message unsubscribes to, to live caller feedback to whatever, right? Even pollster raw interview data you can append. But I'm constantly enriching the voter file over time. You will still, I think, rightly, people should spend their resources close to election day because people tune in late, right? We're weird as political junkies. We want to pay attention early. Most voters are paying attention in the last 21 days of the race, right? And so, which by the way is also an argument for truncating early voting periods, but leave that aside. I think the biggest thing to me is set up disciplined methods of information collection and collation early, because you're not going to be able to do them late. If you're disciplined up front, you establish routines, you establish, say, common reporting formats and cadences with your vendors when there's not a lot of pressure. Then when there's pressure, you've already got those reps done, and you're not going to find yourself in an informational gulf. Nonetheless, people should still spend the bulk of their resources late. I think there are case-by-case arguments for doing things like early TV, doing polling, doing media releases. That stuff is all operational and tactical, and they're going to vary by case by case, right? And depend on how much money you've got coming in the door if you're on the campaign side, et cetera. I think if there is one general lesson to take from this, it's that if you have people who want to donate to an independent expenditure, the earlier the better. There are risks, right? I mean, if you don't have good operatives, they will squander the money, right? You have to, and when people know you're sitting on money and things start to go badly, there's immense pressure to spend, right? JD, and credit to him as a candidate, because he sucked it up and he kept his head down and he survived, but he took incoming for 6 months. There are not a lot of candidates psychologically who can sustain that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even fewer psychologically who can sustain that, knowing that there's an outside group with several millions of dollars who could hit back, right?
I have to think that some of that came from their background as venture capitalists, professional risk takers, and understanding that, you don't prejudge outcomes without data, right? And I think that is a really important lesson for other politicians and candidates, right? Because they react to too much, I think, external stimulus and the weather of the day rather than looking at the data. I think that's the thing that struck me the most watching that race.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I don't want to push the analogy too far, because there's no such thing as runway in a campaign, right? Like I can't do customer acquisition and thereby push back election day, right?
Right.
But certainly the discipline that it imposes is real. It also, frankly, if you look at some of the more successful venture-backed startups, right? Uber benefited from having Lyft, because it meant that the regulators weren't killing one company; they were suddenly killing an industry. In campaigns, you're dealing with a zero-sum space, right? Like, there is no such thing as a Gibbons and Vance voter. You're going to be one or the other. And so that's a difference. But yes, I do think the willingness
Although in
to
my
take.
perfect world, this
Yeah,
is a
that's
little
right.
bit
Well,
of an
you're a ranked
inside
choice
joke.
voting guy, so
Ranked
yeah,
choice
that's true.
voting, you can have one and two.
Yeah, I
That's
as
more
an
just to bother you.
yeah, I'm as an anti-ranked choice voting person. I understand it's a good point, but no, I think ultimately, I hate to say this, but I'll give the Democrats credit on this. Many people do not know, but Emily's List is actually an acronym. Emily stands for Early Money is Like Yeast,
You beat
because
me to it. Yeah.
because it rises. And yeah, I
It
mean,
helps the dough rise. Yeah.
it helps the dough rise, and that's true. So I guess if there's anything that people can learn from this is, yes, you need to have competent professionals who know what they're going to do and who can withstand a lot of pressure, because JD supporters who absolutely wanted the best for him, to be clear, right? They wanted the best for him, but watching him take incoming, fall back in the polls after building himself up, get just hit day after day after day, they wanted the cavalry to come in and rescue him. And saying to those folks, it's too early, it's too early, it's too early, is hard. So you need people who will not give into that pressure to run your IEs, because once a big check is cut, it creates its own dynamics, right? Nonetheless, I think there is a lesson here where if you're willing to risk money on a candidate, risk it earlier rather than later, because the returns are meaningfully bigger.
You're listening to the Business of Politics show. I'm speaking with Luke Thompson about the recent Ohio Senate GOP primary, where he led the Super PAC effort that boosted JD Vance. I want to shift gears now to thinking about kind of the campaigns broadly, just pulling the lens back a little bit. And what are some unexpected or non-obvious ways that technology is having an effect on campaigns in 2022?
Sure. So going back to our Ohio project, one thing we did that's not traditionally done by a super PAC is we helped do crowd driving for JD as he toured um, the state. He did, and I think this was why he excelled in the debates, because he had been soaking in the electorate in really unguarded environments for months. He'd done 60, 70 town halls, Iowa caucus style, before the debates. And we were able to help drive crowds to that using technology. We would, every time his campaign would post a public event, we would then send text messages and robocalls to help drive people to those events. And that instant communication, the ability to communicate in public, thus legally, right, between campaign and super PAC, and then let the super PAC take what was for itself a small amount of our resources, relatively speaking, but for the campaign would have been a large chunk of their resources, and drive attendance and help push support. That sort of thing is hugely important, right? 10 years ago, it would have been very difficult for the campaign to have an easy place to go with, and I could set up tweet notifications and things like that, so that every time they posted something, I knew it was posted. I could go to that public location, see what their schedule was, and provide augmentation. We could do it relatively quickly, right? It's about call it a 30-minute turnaround from that thing posts. I cut a list out of my voter file. I ship it to our text and phone vendor, and then
You were that involved where you were cutting your own lists?
yeah, because I keep overhead low. I cut my own lists. I prefer to. And also, you write the code once, and it's just you toggle a couple of numbers up and down to see what your final total is. It might be a little bit micromanagey, but I would rather work a little harder and a little more to make sure it's right than risk it not being effective. But yeah, so I cut all my own lists: mail universes, text, phone, whatever. That's probably a little insane, but I can't help that.
Well, not everybody has the ability to do that, but also, thinking from a response time, you're not having to see the request, email the request to a vendor assigns it to their junior staffer, and now you've just added 8 hours onto the turnaround time.
Yeah, and I mean, we also I use Slack as a coordinating place for vendors, because you can set up a lot of notifications. The campaign was tweeting out events from a designated sort of account that was posting all the things. We saw that account, and I set up notifications in Slack and also on my personal Twitter. I followed it. So yeah, we were able to reduce response time by a lot, and that was actually huge, because we would get those things set up and press play on them right after we saw the notifications, even if the event was 5 days later. The invites, the things, the calls and texts might not start going out until 24 hours before the event or 36 hours before the event, but we had it done and set 5 days before that, right?
I think this is a really interesting lesson here, and I just want to, from a Startup Caucus perspective, call it out, because we invest in vertical software as a service companies, right? So specific to this niche, we are not looking for technology that is going to completely revolutionize American democracy and replace social media networks. But what you're saying here is that the biggest impact of technology is in management, operations, communication, and just how we run campaigns.
Yeah, I mean, it really, I think well used, it makes you more effective with lower overhead. There's a there used to be, I think this has kind of been beaten out of the political class, but there was, at least through 2016, this kind of Obama-derived guruism that believed that you could put campaigns on autopilot, that you could automate them, and the models would automatically update and the strategy would present itself. And I do think a lot of the Clinton campaign in 2016 was built around this myth. And the truth is, technology, data, these are all great for operational and tactical efficiency, but they don't answer strategic questions. There's no replacement for strategic judgment. Now, You can have better and less well-informed strategic judgment, and that's where technology can be an enhancement for strategy. But there is no substitute for having a path to victory, knowing how to get there, and then ruthlessly pursuing it.
I think I'm going to say yet. I think we'll get there, just not right now.
Yeah, I see. I don't think so because
Well, you'd be out of a job.
Well, no, I believe me, I'll be fine in that environment. It's this. You cannot answer an unlimited number. You cannot ask an unlimited number of questions. And so ultimately, the data you receive is only as good as the inputs that you put into it. And those inputs are going to be determined by a human being, because even an NLP is not going to have the kind of synoptic, comprehensive range of possible ideas that a human being will, right? There is no replacement for insight. I'll give you an example. We modeled a question in, I think, our second modeling round that helped us identify really disaffected voters. We asked a question which was, which of these best describes your view? And I'm not going to get it exactly right, but of the federal government. Obviously, there was a satisfied, happy option, which very few people took. Angry, disappointed, and disgusted. And those three things mapped out really three discrete chunks of the electorate. Now, no natural language processing algorithm is going to come up with that unless somebody's asked it before, and it may not apply all the time. Just like people used to sit there and point to,
you're saying the specific terms or the shades of difference in meaning?
The shades of difference in meaning, and also to ask the question at all.
Okay.
Right? Why ask that question? Well, we wanted to ask the question because this was back when JD was just getting brutalized by the Club for Growth ads, and polling or modeling off of our ballot was going to tell us what our absolute fortification baseline vote was, but it wasn't going to tell us how to get to a win, right? From 9% to 32%. And so we wanted to find out chunks of people who we felt like the other candidates weren't talking to. Chunks of people who were looking for something that they weren't getting, and that's what we did as an option, and it popped. The disgusted group in particular, those were folks who they were late breakers. They followed the Trump endorsement in meaningful ways, but a lot of them came our way, and they were. These were really disenchanted people looking for something that was not just the humdrum run-of-the-mill message.
Luke, I am going to ask you a variation of the Peter Thiel question, which is, what is your most unpopular professional opinion about politics that puts you most outside of the mainstream?
I have so many, Eric.
I need you to pick one.
My most unpopular or my most obscure? My most unpopular, I guess, is that campaigns don't matter in 99% of the cases, right? I mean, that we're pretty much tilting at windmills.
Right.
I
think deep down, a lot of people would agree to that. They just wouldn't admit it in a client pitch.
Yeah, probably. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. That's probably my most unpopular.
Yeah.
I mean, look, I think we did really great work, and I guess you could make an argument that we were essential to giving JD a shot. But I'll tell you this. That ad that he put on TV was a huge difference maker. We had moved him into a position where he was a contender for first place with two ads that were very sort of strategically drawn. We wanted to identify him as a conservative because we saw that he had moved off of being seen as a conservative. So we used his own words to give a synopsis of his worldview. Hard to do in 24 seconds or whatever, but we managed. Credit to Dan Huey, my ad guy, for wedging all that in there in a way that was pretty effective. And then we ran that, and then followed on with second ad that was linking him to the immigration issue as the kind of touchstone for his candidacy. At that point, we ran that through the beginning of early voting, and then kind of had to pass the baton to the campaign and hope that they would take and run with it. And I've seen it reported that JD actually wrote his own ad. The "Are you a racist?" We call them clutter cutters in the business ad. It broke through. I'll tell you, we polled after his ad run was coming to an end, or as it was coming to an end, And that ad had as high a recall with the primary electorate as all of the debates combined, including the fact that there was a fight at one of the debates, right? So, yes, we, like I said, I think you could make the argument that we put him in a position, but I don't know that, right? It's possible that all the work we did building him up could have been done just by that single ad. We'll never know, right? We'll never know, but certainly that ad was impactful, and I think really sealed the argument.
So I want to give you one more bite at the apple. What's your
My most
unpopular
unpopular
opinion?
I mean, honestly, I guess I don't know if this is unpopular. It's probably obscure. Almost all primary voting habits are historical legacies of denominational alignments of people's ancestors.
Like religious denominations.
Yeah, religious denominations, which are almost impossible to model. So you have to figure out other ways to get around it.
Huh.
So yeah, it's
What's
tough.
an example of how you would discern that?
So, well, I'll give you an example from an old race I did years ago. Tim Huelskamp was the incumbent congressman in, this would have been 2016, in Kansas's first district, which is Western Kansas, where my mother's family's from, actually, originally. And everybody there pretty much looks the same. Everybody's white, everybody's Republican, everybody has roughly the same educational attainment. There's some variation in income, but not a lot, heavily rural, right? And spread out over a huge swath. But there are Methodists, there are German Catholics, there are some Lutherans, and there are Baptists. And if you look at where those folks align on primaries, just at a kind of anecdotal or networked level, you will see that they still, they split, right? There's a kind of subconscious cultural legacy there that's doing a lot of work.
Even if the church attendance numbers don't line up.
Is nil, yeah. Yeah, I mean, somebody who's, look, let's put it to you this way. The single best predictor of partisanship in the United States is what party your parents belong to, right? We like to think of ourselves as reasoning beings, but we are highly contextualized reasoning beings. I do think we reason, but we reason within parameters. Now, it's endogenous, your material interest, your cultural heritage, your party ID as it's a freestanding identity insofar as that's a thing that exists, right? So these things are all intermingled in ways that make teasing out the actual discrete effects of one versus the other more or less impossible. But the point is, we are sort of we are servants or slaves to dead hands that we only dimly perceive. And religion is a big one of those. Now, obviously, religion intersects with ethnicity, intersects with family, etc. Those are really hard things to identify because we don't have data on it and it's not easily monetized. So if we had data, it would tell us a whole lot. But if you start to try to tease out how people are different through attitudinal questions, questions about how they view authority and things like that, you can get proxies for a lot of that. It can be very difficult to model at times without having, bringing in additional data from, say, census-derived scores of likely ethnicity and things like that. The measurements of frequency of moving, et cetera. And even then, in most cases, you're not going to find something because you're just not going to get a performative model, right? The log loss on the model is not going to overpredict versus a polling crosstab. But that I think is probably my most controversial opinion, is that we only dimly perceive our own minds.
Okay, I want to one final question for you before I let you go. What is a problem or challenge that you see in the political industry? Maybe it's something you just recently went through and experienced that you think would make for a good startup to tackle.
I mean, I think there are some startups tackling this. In general, I think political startups run the risk of trying to do everything, right? Because they're hungry for clients. They say yes to everything, and then they wind up doing nothing particularly well. Election law allows outside groups and campaigns to share a lot of information that's not strategic, including a lot of data. With Protect Ohio Values, I uploaded large numbers of segments into an online marketplace hosted by Deeproot and white labeled the campaign to buy against those, right? So the campaign didn't know exactly how the segments were derived. They just had to trust me, but they could buy digital ads against those across a lot of different platforms. I think I mean, that was a great tool. But what would be really amazing is if you had a campaign startup that had very user-friendly interfaces. This is not so much for me because I'm more of a write it in the code window guy, but very user-friendly interfaces where campaigns and super PACs could, in legally compliant ways, essentially read off the same database, upload their data reciprocally, and as long as you had some parameters around like value exchange,
Right.
you could do that legally. The key would be reliability and making sure that you were, sort of blessed and signed off in every possible legal way. I'm not an attorney. I spend a lot of time doing outside groups, so I have a pretty good idea of campaign finance laws as applies to independent expenditure and other independent groups. However, I think that if there's somebody listening to this who's thinking of a startup,
you have just given them the idea for the most niche startup
it's
in the
niche.
world.
It's niche, but the truth is, like, shared database. I mean, something where everybody's pulling lists off the same database, so it's not living on my desktop.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a real upside to that, because if you're let's say you're an independent expenditure group like the Senate or the Senate Leadership Fund or the Congressional Leadership Fund or their Democratic counterparts, you could spend a lot of money enriching voter files, and then campaigns could be pulling out of that. And then by pulling out also, especially if they're piping through to digital ads, you could be collecting data back.
Yeah, and that was going to be the second point. Very niche, but indexes very highly on the money factor. So that is a
if a man with a hammer sees every problem as a nail, I might be falling into that trap. But certainly I think there's some value there. People have built pretty quality campaign technology with an eye to facilitating volunteer actions, facilitating field phones, text, etc. That's really great. The digital ad platforms, there's a certain ambivalence that they have because of reputational considerations and frankly ideological motivation from their staff. But where there is some tech to be done, it's almost like a B2B project. Right.
Well, thank you, Luke, for joining us today. We had a great conversation. You can go follow Luke on Twitter. I'll include a link in the show notes. Please remember to subscribe to the Business of Politics show wherever you listen to podcasts. And if today's episode made you just a little bit smarter, which I don't know how it couldn't have from all the knowledge that we got from Luke, please share it with a friend or colleague, because it's going to make you look smarter in the process. So, and finally, if you have been listening for a while, please go leave us a review on iTunes or the Google Play Store, because that is the most important thing for discovery and helping new people find us. So with that, I want to say thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.